It is interesting from this perspective. I can't see the TV, so hopefully if I double-click aside, you'll let me know if I miss something. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. As Peter mentioned, NCREIF conducted a survey of its data contributing members this past summer, and we're going to talk about the results today. I'm going to take you through some of the results, some of the things we found, some of the things that we didn't learn, which is also interesting. And then we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion afterwards. Again, that will be 3 parts. So we're going to talk through a little bit about their impressions of the survey. We're also going to then talk about some of the risks that we should be thinking about that we aren't, and some of the risks that we need to deal with in the future. We're also going to talk about some of the changes that may be necessary to keep risk management evolving. So I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion. The prep call was quite entertaining. The 3 of them really hit it off, so hopefully you'll find that as interesting as I did. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the Director of Research at NCREIF. My name is Jeff Havsy. So we'll dig into, and this is meant to be interactive. Feel free to raise your hand with any questions, yell it out if I don't see you or don't raise it. So please feel free to interrupt, and I don't want me just talking to you the whole time, hopefully. All right, so we sent it to 71 data contributing members. We had 23 responses, which is 32%. From NCREIF's perspective, it's actually kind of unusual. We're used to asking for data and you submit it, right? So this was a voluntary survey, and not getting 100% threw me for a little bit. We had a survey from a corporate perspective and from an investment perspective. You say, well, really? Well, what's the need? And in some cases, we ended up with the same response. Some people said, hey, listen, our answers are the same, organization runs the same, it doesn't matter. But for some of the other organizations, what we found was the way they treated risk management was different. Whether or not you were thinking about it and they were often part of a larger organization, but the investment management group and what they did and how they behaved and their views and what structures they had were different than the corporate perspective. And as we go through some of the responses as to what people worry about, you'll see that there's some big differences on the corporate versus the investment perspective, both from the financial side and the operational side. Of the questions we asked 14 for the investment, 15 for the corporate, and 12 of them overlapped. So of those, 28% were compliance officers, 11% came from general counsels, 28% were senior accounting officers, and about 40% were from other. Now, one of the things that a lot of the survey results that came in talked about was, hey, here's how we're structured, and we do have a chief compliance officer, but really it is a group effort. So a lot of the members had teams, organizations, committees, whatever the case may be, and it involved not only senior executives, but also specialists within the organization, whether that be environmental, whether on the reporting side, some of the risk reporting. So you had a team that comprised both senior and mid-level individuals in a committee structure, and that committee was constantly evolving. So depending on what the needs were, what the organization was facing, you had some different things going on there. And I'm going to address one of the things on the timing, and I'll get to that in a minute, but it was interesting too as to how frequent this committee met or how frequently risks were talked about. With regards to the size of the respondents, so about 1/4, 24% had greater than 50 billion in AUM. So you had some big managers. At the same time, less than $1 billion, you had 29%. So it wasn't disproportionately weighted to one size or another. You had 1 to 5 billion, again, slightly more than a quarter of the respondents, and then 5 to 50 was 18%. So we felt it was a pretty diverse response among the size of the managers, and you had some small managers versus some large managers that did different things or had the resources to do different things within their structures. So let's talk about first on the financial risk, and this is from the investment perspective. As you might imagine, real estate markets and cycles were the most important risk for them, right? That was driving their concern. What was at the bottom, though, was currency, and it was significantly less than any other. The difference between leverage, transaction structures and partners, financial and capital markets, and then tenant versus credit, they were very tightly bunched. They were all within about 20 basis points, those four together. So you had a big gap between real estate markets, the next four, and then another big gap down to currency. And I'll overlay that with the corporate one in a moment, but it is, it's nothing surprising about this, right? Nothing that jumps out and say, oh, I'm shocked by it. On the operational side, though, environmental was the biggest risk. And I was a little bit surprised at that. I would have guessed regulatory, given what's going on in today's world and so much that I hear about with regards to reporting and things like that. Regulatory was second, and so it is up there. But I was surprised that environmental was the biggest one. Again, I think the panel might touch on that a little bit. Competition, natural disasters. At the bottom, you had political and terrorism, though I guess if they had listened to Jim's speech last night, maybe that moves up in the rankings. I don't know. And then cyber was a little bit in the middle. Now, if we compare that, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw up the corporate perspective, and then I'm going to overlay the graphs, and we can talk about that in a little bit. So on the corporate perspective, your real estate markets and cycles, you had transaction structures. Currency was again at the bottom, though again it ends up being rated slightly higher than it was, and leverage, tenant credit were closely bunched. On the operational side, now here's where you see it, right? So regulatory ends up being number one here, with environmental a little bit further down. Competition was also ranked higher than environmental on the corporate side. So let's look at the overlay and compare the two. And this is one of the reasons that we ended up doing two surveys. Is when we first started out, we said, well, wait a second, how are we going to ask it? The feedback we got from the respondents, who said as we're trying to design the survey, they said, well, what perspective are you asking from? And this is why. So you see, real estate markets and cycles, but transaction and structures from an investment perspective, much more important than from a corporate perspective. On the flip side of that, tenant/credit from a corporate perspective mattered more than it did from an investment perspective. Let's say currency was at the bottom for both of them. On the operational side, I'd say environmental from the investment perspective, but regulatory from the corporate perspective. Political and terrorism had much higher ratings from a corporate perspective than they did from the investment perspective. Cyber also had a much bigger risk from a corporate perspective than it did from an investment perspective. So let's talk a little bit about the survey itself, or some of the things that we found. So of the respondents, only 13 had risk modeling systems, and then 10 of those had software monitoring systems. And I think that goes back to the size of the managers. The larger managers and were able to invest in this, whereas some of the smaller managers did not have as much of an investment in the systems that they could have put in. With regards to the monitoring systems, most of them were just reporting. They were not action-based systems. So as soon as somebody did something, whether it's the leverage level got too high, some other report came back, that was kicked off or some warning was sent, and again, we didn't get the details of how that works, is whether that's an email, whether that's a red light. The questions were not that detailed. But it was more often than not, a flag was sent up to somewhere within the firm saying, hey, you're in violation, this is what the violation is, but it didn't stop that from happening. What it did is it hopefully caused some action. They were described as enterprise risk management systems, so again, we did not ask for all the details of them. Some of the responses seemed to imply that they were fairly robust. They had some scenario analysis, especially some of the bigger firms that answered it talked about being able to do some scenario analysis within the monitoring so they could see what happens if and how that impacts. And again, not only the performance of the real estate, but the impact throughout the organization. But I don't have all the details. We did get, one thing that was interesting was some of them named the systems, and a lot of them were customized systems. They said, we've used something off the shelf and then we've customized it to fit our needs. but they didn't overlap. The base was different. They weren't the same. Oh, we use company XYZ's system. With regards to a media strategy, only about 50% have a media strategy. I think this is probably the answer that surprised me the most, because I would have thought that we'd have a much higher percentage of firms that are prepared in case something happens. And again, whether that be on the financial side or the operational side, I would expect in today's world, the PR battle's kind of half of what goes on, right? So often, though, what we did have is that some of the smaller managers said, that just said, oh, person XYZ handles all corporate communication, and so it might be something like that. But I would have expected even some of the mid-sized ones to have a better plan, right? Because you want to control the story rather than the story controlling you. And then the other thing is only 78%. I guess I probably would have assumed it was 100%, and maybe it was the way the question was phrased within the survey, but only 78% involved risk management in the investment process. Whereas I would have expected, everybody to involve risk management rather than after the fact. You want them in beforehand. And again, part of it could have been the survey design, which would then fall on my fault, right? So bad execution. From the way I would have phrased the question. That is definitely one of the things that we learned, is that it is more important to get better detail within the, as we put out the surveys. So there was the CEM benchmarking in Toronto, and they surveyed the risk management practices of 27 large pension plans around the world. And again, our survey was investment managers, and you'll see within the survey, again, when you get a chance to look at the report, it is interesting to compare and contrast how the plan sponsor's thinking about it relative to how the investment managers, and there's some definite differences within the responses. And then Advisen looked at 507 risk managers, insurance buyers, and other professionals, identifying primary risks and best in class. And once again, their results from some of the insurance buyers and other risk professionals compared to the investment management arm, again, there was some overlap that you would expect, but there are also some big differences on how things were done. So we took some of the nuggets out of those two surveys, and we included them in the report that you received. And we thought that was a nice compare and contrast. Going forward, hopefully we can find ways. We've talked to both of these organizations, and hopefully in the future we can come to some type of way to work together that might compare and contrast different users within the space, whether that be the sources of capital in addition to the managers, and see how they have different views of the world.